So before I go too much further into I Remember Lemuria, I just want to take a pause and ask, what is this Lemuria that Mr. Shaver is so excited to remember? Perhaps some of you have heard of Lemuria before in other works of science fiction and fantasy, perhaps not. I would like to unpack that a little bit, and while I'm here I thought I might as well get into some of the related concepts like, of course, Atlantis and Mu, which are all terms that he seems to be using more or less interchangeably. And the history is definitely linked, but there are differences. So let's begin with the best known of the three, and that is Atlantis, which I will breeze past very quickly, because most of it you probably already know, and a lot of it Ray Palmer already lined out in the extremely intrusive annotations of Chapter 1, all of that stuff about Plato and his book Timaeus. What he didn't mention is that the Timaeus was a work of fiction. This was not mythology, this was not history, this was fiction. Plato made it up to make an allegory about ancient Greece's favorite subject, other than that one, hubris. Greeks love talking about hubris, and Atlantis was an elaborate allegory for hubris. The current scientific consensus is, in fact, that it would be impossible for a continent to sink beneath the waves over the course of a couple days or whatever Plato's extremely brief time frame is. That is impossible. Continents move way slower than that, and this is actually really cool. The rocks on the surface are lighter and less dense than the rocks, miles below sea level, right? That stands to reason. As the Earth was being formed, all of the heaviest rocks move toward the core, and all the less heavy rocks are pushed up toward the surface. So if a continent were to sink, you would find a lot of surface rocks on the bottom of the ocean, right? And we have not. In any of these proposed sunken continent locations that I'm about to get into. So yeah, it is impossible for a continent to sink like that. Sea levels can rise, of course, and that is something to be afraid of, but the idea of a continent to just topple into the sea couldn't happen. Let's get into the next one, Lemuria itself. And this is the one that has the most of a seed, I would say, of actual science in it. It was proposed in 1864 by I believe he was a zoologist named Philip Sclater. And he noticed that there were lemurs in Madagascar and in India, but not lemurs or even fossil evidence of extinct lemurs in mainland Africa or the Middle East. So the question was, how did they get the dispersal that they did? And he proposed a lost continent that had once existed that he named Lemuria. Or Lemuria, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I've always said Lemuria. One of my little annotation boxes in Chapter 1 of I Remember Lemuria referred to it as a lost continent famous for its lemurs. That wasn't a joke. That is the actual history of this concept. And as I say, this is the one with the most potential grain of truth here, because although a continent cannot sink, as we now know, we did not know, Philip Sclater didn't know this, and that's not his fault. When he came up with this theory, we didn't have the idea of plate tectonics, continental drift, nothing like this was really very well understood yet. But there was a continent once that linked Madagascar to India. We now call it Gondwana, and it did break apart. It didn't sink, but it broke apart, so he was onto something. But at some point, somebody noticed that Lemuria lined up very nicely with a Tamil myth, and forgive me if I mispronounce this right, but they had a similar myth to Atlantis called Kumari Kandam, that was this hypothetical, mythical city that sank beneath the waves. And people thought, like, oh wow, maybe this myth is referring to the lost continent of Lemuria. Now, of course, Gondwana broke apart long before humanity of any kind existed. That's the geologic time frame we're dealing with here. And there is a hazard that you can easily fall into whenever you are trying to find any kind of literal, rational, objective truth in folklore, especially folklore from a culture that is not your own. where you probably will not really understand any of the concepts or context for any of this. And that was what happened. And of course, whenever a colonial presence is trying to understand a colonized people's folklore, especially through some kind of, when they're trying to force it to fit an agenda, a lot of details will be changed and fudged and forgotten and lost to better twist it into the shape they want it to be. And so the idea of Lemuria drifted from geological speculation into the realm of pseudoscience, the occult, theosophy. The very famous occultist Helena Blavatsky came up with this theory that not only was Lemuria real, it also connected to Australia and Tasmania, and she came up with this whole elaborate and very racist theory on the origins of Australian and Tasmanian Aborigines based on the fall of Lemuria. I don't want to get into it here, but a lot of it was actually quite popular among white settlers of Australia and Tasmania as a way to quiet their conscience about all the genocide that was going on. And to this day, all of Britain's remaining territories in the Indian Ocean, they have a shared coat of arms whose Latin motto reads, "Lemuria is in our charge." They spell it Lemuria rather than Lemuria, but whatever. So that's Lemuria. Let's talk about Mu. Mu actually was also first proposed in 1864 by the French ethnographer Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, who was translating a Mayan codex, and he thought he had found reference to a sunken city called Mu. Now, my default assumption whenever I find a story from one culture that lines up very well with a story from another culture where they could not reasonably have had contact is to say that it's probably some kind of common archetype, because you can find versions of the Noah's Ark story among the Inuit people. Like, some of these ideas are going to occur to you and are going to be a story in just about every culture. It later turned out that de Bourbourg had actually mistranslated. The Mayans probably did not have a legendary sunken city, but another ethnographer, anthropologist guy whose name was Augustus de Plongeon, he came up with this theory that not only was Mu a real place, it was in fact the Mayan name for Atlantis. It was the same place, forgetting that Atlantis, again, was fictional, not mythical, but fictional. And here we're getting into these ideas of like cultural diffusion, that the Greeks and the Mayans shared a common cultural lineage from Atlantis or Mu itself. And cultural diffusion is this theory that was big in the 19th century, early 20th century, that every advanced, complex, civilized society all shared some common cultural lineage, that there was an original civilization from which all others were descended. And this is an idea that kind of makes sense if you take a purely Euro-Mediterranean-ocentric view, where you can trace most European societies to the Romans. From the Romans, you can go to the Greeks, to the Mycenaeans, to Egypt, to the Mesopotamian cultures. But then you look at China, or the Mayans, or Great Zimbabwe and the guys who built that. So that's cultural diffusion, and it's silly. The theory of Mu carried on. It was discovered by a guy named James Churchward, and he's the real transformation point in Mu as a concept. He moved it from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and he decided that it was not the same as Atlantis, it was actually the same as Lemuria, even though the whole point of Lemuria was that it was in the Indian Ocean, not the Pacific Ocean. None of it makes sense. And Churchward became kind of fascinated by, kind of obsessed by, finding evidence of this ancient Lemurian civilization. So whenever anything cool was found in the Pacific, like the Moai heads on Rapa Nui, or Easter Island as it's sometimes known, or the ruins at Nan Madol, he would decide like that is an ancient Lemurian relic, even though we now know most of it was built in like the 12th century or so by like actual Polynesian people. I don't know if these weird occult fringe guys were more racist than usual, or if it's just that things were very, very racist then, and it infected the pseudoscience as well as the mainstream politics and thinking. Speaking of people who were about average racist for their time and place, H.P. Lovecraft name drops Churchward in a couple of his stories, and the idea of a sunken civilization may sound very familiar if you've read The Call of Cthulhu or anything like that. And a lot of these ideas start to filter their way into popular culture. Lemuria shows up in a Harryhausen movie, The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, which rules, by the way. There's a Toho movie called Atragon, where they find out that Mew is still alive and kicking, and they've got, like, sea serpents and things, and they're trying to invade the surface world. It is a surprisingly sober film, in spite of its gleefully silly premise. It is full of long monologues about the nature of nationalism in a post-war world order. And in Godzilla vs. Megalon, the Moe heads are once again linked to an ancient sunken civilization they call Seatopia, who summon a giant stupid beetle to make war on the surface world. Seatopia is a society that consists entirely of angry gym teachers. And the process by which these ideas become the stuff of pulp, I think, really starts with guys like Shaver. True believers who want to share these ideas with the world, but as these ideas move outside the terrarium of fringe occult communities and into the wider readership of the pulp sci-fi magazines, they can't really survive, or at least their credibility can't survive. You're encountering a much more skeptical readership, and also just the framing of these ideas as the stuff of sci-fi and fantasy hurts the credibility as well, even though they are technically reaching a wider audience. And to be clear, I Remember Lemuria did reach a very wide audience. It was a really big hit when it was first published, and for years afterward, Amazing Stories would continue to publish more and more Shaver-related material, to the point where people actually got sick of it. And you know how nowadays we've got these guys who make it their entire personality to be sick of Marvel movies? Well, that was, for a brief period in the 1940s, there were people who really wanted you to know how sick they were of the Richard Sharp Shaver expanded literary universe. And, you still see Shaver-esque ancient buried civilizations in the newer Godzilla movies. You see it in the new Zelda game. But nobody takes it seriously anymore. I don't. But it's fun. It's the same thing that happened with cryptozoology. It's just a bit of fun now. And we've more or less jettisoned most of the unfortunate imperialist baggage that a lot of it comes with. Not entirely, and I still encourage anyone who is reading up on, who is a cryptozoology buff or whatnot, to be careful with some of this stuff. Take it with a grain of salt, because you can get into some very colonialist ways of thinking with it. But have fun with it. I am. That's why I'm doing this series. So enjoy, and don't let the Diros bite. This exhibit was made possible by the generous support of my amazing Patreon fans, my amazing Patreon people, particularly Michael Fattori, Zanazira, Zachary Snowden-Smith, and Break System BSE. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider throwing us a few dollars here and there on Patreon or Ko-fi. In the meantime, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, thanks for enjoying early 20th century craziness, and thanks for being you.